welcome back to Pursuing Justice. I'm Harriet Hendel, and today we're speaking with Jim McCloskey, who was our guest last week. Please tune in to our earlier podcast so you can hear about the inception of Centurion Ministries, which we will be talking about in just a few minutes, and the reason that Jim decided to create this organization, which helps people who are wrongly accused of crimes they did not commit and people who end up behind bars. Today, we are continuing our discussion about Centurion Ministries and a sampling of some of the many cases, too many to cover them all, that the organization has taken on. And we will have Jim give you the website and a way to contact them if you so choose. Just to enlighten people, Jim, how many requests do you get at Centurion Ministries in a year, and where do the requests come from?
Well, I'm wondering, do we want to first establish how Centurion was even set up initially, or
yes,
if you're happy,
sure.
if you want to,
sure.
I mean, if you want to go there, I could go there. But
sure.
Yeah, so we left off in the first podcast where I had committed to do what I take a year off from school and work on behalf of Mr. De Los Santos. So a number of things were accomplished during that year. First of all, I interviewed a couple private investigators. I did not trust them. They just didn't seem like the right kind of people to do this kind of work. So I ended up doing the investigation myself. And the first thing I did, I went up to the crime scene at the time it took place in Newark at nighttime, at the same time of year. And I discovered very easily that the eyewitness who claims he saw Chiefy and another man flee the scene of the crime after hearing gunshots, because of the darkness and distance, it was impossible for him to have seen what he said he saw. In addition to that, during my investigation, I met him. His name was Pat, first name Pat. I met Pat and some of his associates, and they told me that his associates did that Pat admitted to them that he lied, that he made this story up against Chiefy and the other man, whose name was Lamont Harvey, who was later cleared because, as it turned out, he was in Oakland, California when this crime took place. But anyway, Pat decided to give false testimony because he himself was in trouble with his own crimes with the Essex County Prosecutor's Office, and Chiefy and Lamont had robbed him at a drug house a year or 2 years ago of some $80. So that was his retribution to send Chiefy away for life because of these factors. So then also, I interviewed a number of attorneys and finally found a lawyer, an attorney by the name of Morton Stavis, who was a renowned constitutional lawyer and criminal defense lawyer out of Hoboken. And he introduced me to Paul Castellero, who he assigned to be Chiefy's attorney in post-conviction. So it was Paul and I who worked hand in hand over the next 2 years to develop the new evidence. And among other things, we demonstrated that the jailhouse confession, the career criminal Richard Delasante, who's told the jury that Chiefy had confessed to him in detail the facts, the commission of the crime. It took me a year, but Delasante refused to talk to me. But through his relatives, he finally agreed to speak with me. So I visited him a year after I began this work, and he told me the whole sordid story about how he was a lifelong informant for the prosecutor's office, and how the prosecutor's detective had compelled him to make up this confession story against Chiefy, how the prosecutor himself, the trial prosecutor of Chiefy, had suborned his own perjury because Richard Delasante was, as I said, an informant on many different cases prior to Chiefy's case. and the trial prosecutor knew it. Paul was able to draw up a very strong and detailed petition of new evidence to the federal district court, and we got ourselves a hearing. And prior to that hearing, we were able to get permission, authorization from the judge for complete access to the prosecutor's file. In that prosecutor's file, in the prosecutor's own handwriting. Now, this is in 1983. It is 8 or 9 years after the conviction, when Richard De La Sante testified at trial that he never informed anybody else. He was never informant. He had no informant history. We found in the prosecutor's own pretrial handwriting, De La Sante in habit of giving testimony.
Oh.
So he knew that his witness was lying when he had him testify that he never informed anybody or gave any testimony against anybody else. So as a result of this, the hearing was conducted in March of '83, and on July 5th or 6th of that year, Federal District Judge Frederick Lacy issued his opinion. And in that opinion, he granted Mr. De Los Santos a new trial, saying that the witnesses against him were reprehensible in character and had clearly perjured themselves with the knowledge of the prosecutor. And with that, Mr. De Los Santos was freed and exonerated in July of 1983. By that time, I had finished my year of working full-time on his behalf, returned to the seminary to finish my degree, while continuing to work on his behalf, had met 2 other New Jersey lifers in whose innocence I had come to believe, graduated from the seminary. So now we're in July of '83, and we free Chief De Los Santos and bring him home to his devoted wife, Elena, who would visit him two times a week throughout all those years. And it was a great feeling to free him and bring him home.
And how many years did he actually serve?
He actually served 8 years for that murder out of a life sentence. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, was he fortunate to have found you? And the 2 others that was a question I was going to ask you is how did you connect with, after Chiefy was free, then what? Yeah. And you already had had a lineup, a short lineup, right?
Well, that's right. Okay, so Chiefy's freed and exonerated.
Right.
By that time, I had met 2 other New Jersey lifers, innocence I'd come to believe. And I graduated from the sub. Now I have a choice. Now it's the 3rd fork in the road. All right. Am I going to go on and somehow continue this work and do this work on behalf of these 2 men in whose innocence I'd come to believe, or am I going to go on as I originally intended and get ordained to become a Presbyterian church pastor? Well, obviously I chose the former. And so a couple things occurred that were signs again to me. And that by the time Chiefy was freed, I was dead broke, had no money. But my parents came into an extraordinary gift and they gave each of their 3 kids a $10,000 tax-free gift. I looked at that as a sign from God and as manna from heaven. And I'm going to use this $10,000 as capital to start up a new nonprofit organization I'm going to call Centurion Ministries. And I named it Centurion after the centurion at the foot of the cross in the Gospel of Luke, who looks up at the crucified Christ and said, surely this one was innocent. That's where the name came from. And I tacked on ministries because I felt it was my own particular ministry. Now, at that time, Harriet, I'm living and I had been since I took that year's leave of absence from the seminary. I'm living in a home in Princeton, owned and occupied by a septuagenarian, Mrs. Yateman, who was 81 years old, a delightful woman. my bedroom was rent-free in exchange for me helping her around the house and doing errands. In addition, that was Centurion's headquarters for the first 6 or 7 years of doing this work until 1987. So I set up Centurion, named it as I have described, with the $10,000, and felt that this was my call this was my ministry, this was my work. I believe, still do, that all the ups and downs of my personal life and professional life and spiritual life, everything had prepared me for this destiny that the Lord had set me aside for. He knew my peculiarities, my personality, my nature, and this is the work that I want you to do. So I felt that this was my life's calling. This was what I was appointed to do, and I set about to do it.
Right. So now you've set up the organization, and it was who was part of that those early days of Centurion Ministries besides Paul, whom you've already mentioned?
Yeah, now Paul wasn't an employee, but he was an outside attorney who I retained to work on these cases.
Okay.
And he practically worked these cases pro bono, although I did raise some money to pay him, but he had his own solo practice in Hoboken, New Jersey.
I see.
And when I started these other cases, one, Nate Walker in particular was one of the two, Paul, I asked Paul if he would become Nate's lawyer as well as he was Chiefy's lawyer, and he agreed to do that. So I was able to raise some money for him, but not nearly what he deserved to be remunerated with. So from when I set up Centurion in '83 until Paul and I freed the next person, Nate Walker, in November of '86, I was working alone out of Mrs. Yateman's house. Then Paul and I, we were able to free Mr. Walker. Now, Mr. Walker had been convicted and sentenced to life plus 50 years consecutive for a sexual assault and kidnapping of a woman in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Well, this is pre-DNA now. What Paul and I did, we convinced the Union County, one of the prosecutors, a leading executive prosecutor in the Union County office, that's up in Elizabeth, to look for the vaginal swab that was taken from the victim 11 years earlier. Because we knew that it had semen on it, at least it was described as having the rapist's semen on it. His name was Richard Rodbart. Now, Rodbart, he was in charge of all the attorneys, felony attorneys in that office. But he was Nate Walker's trial prosecutor. I give him all the credit in the world. Now, there were some spirited conversations between Paul and me and Mr. Rodbart about Nate Walker's innocence. But he finally agreed. All right, I'm going to look for that vaginal swab and we'll get it tested. He did. He found it and sent it down the FBI serology lab, and they came back and said that the donor of the semen on the vaginal swab, namely the rapist, he had blood type A, and Nate had blood type B. So Nate Walker, through blood typing of biological fluid, was exonerated, cleared, and freed. That was a big story in the U.S. at that time. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, you go ahead, Jim.
Well, I just want to say, we freed Nate in early November of 1986.